The phone rang at 3 in the morning. Glendale reached for it in the dark, fumbling, disoriented. The voice on the other end was his estranged wife, Gail. And she was screaming. Water. Drowning. The van. Then nothing. The call came from somewhere in Craven County, North Carolina. But when authorities traced it, when they searched the coordinates, when they combed every road and ditch and waterway they could find, there was nothing there either. 2 people had called for help, and then they vanished. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. December in eastern North Carolina has a particular quality to it. The light comes late and leaves early. The air hangs heavy with moisture from the rivers and sounds that lace through the coastal plain. Fog settles in the low places. It doesn't lift so much as it slowly dissolves, revealing the world piece by piece. On the morning of December 7th, 2004, that fog was thick. Gail Haddock-Dale was 59 years old. She lived in Kinston, a small city in Lenoir County where tobacco once ruled and the rhythm of life still moved with the seasons. She was preparing for a trip that morning. Not a long one. Just a drive to Roanoke, Virginia, to visit her brother for an early Christmas celebration. She wasn't going alone. Her granddaughter, Heather Lynn Roberts, would be with her. Heather was 15. She lived with Gail. Had for most of her life. They weren't just grandmother and granddaughter. They were each other's constant. Heather had been born into a life that required extraordinary resilience. She came into the world with severe physical and developmental challenges. Doctors didn't expect her to survive infancy. But she did. When she was 8 years old, she survived again. This time a house fire that left her with terrible burns across her body. The pain, the surgeries, the slow healing. She endured it all. And something else happened in the aftermath of that fire. Heather began talking about angels. Not in vague, childlike terms. She described them in detail. She spoke of dreams where she met them, where they told her things. She talked about heaven the way some people talk about a place they've visited and plan to return to. Her grandmother believed her. Gail wrote about Heather's experiences in a book called Talks with Angels. It described Heather's visions, her medical journey, her unshakable faith. The book attracted attention. So did Heather. Collectors of precious moments figurines, those delicate porcelain figures with teardrop eyes, began writing to her, sending her gifts. Eventually, the Precious Moments Company itself took notice. They created a figurine inspired by one of Heather's dreams. In the dream, Jesus had told her that one day soon, she would live in heaven. And when she got there, she could play with her 2 kittens, Baby and Pumpkin, who had died. The figurine showed a little girl with teardrop eyes, holding an angel and 2 kittens. It was supposed to represent hope, comfort, the idea that suffering has meaning. No one could have known how soon that dream would feel less like a promise and more like a prophecy. The van Gail drove was a 1998 Dodge Caravan. Dark in color. Reliable. Nothing fancy. It had carried them on dozens of trips before. To the grocery store, to church, to doctor's appointments. Heather's life required a lot of appointments. On the morning of December 7th, they loaded the van with whatever they'd need for the visit. Overnight bags. Gifts, probably. Snacks for the road. The drive to Roanoke wasn't far. A few hours, depending on traffic and stops. Gail had made trips like this before. She knew the roads. But that morning, the fog was different. It wasn't the kind that burned off by mid-morning. It clung. It thickened. In some places along the rural highways of eastern North Carolina, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Gail and Heather left Kinston and headed out. For a while, everything seemed fine. But somewhere along the route, on some stretch of road where the fog pressed in and the familiar became unrecognizable, Gail got lost. She wasn't sure where she was. She couldn't see landmarks. The roads in that part of North Carolina twist and turn, following old property lines and waterways. In good weather, they're straightforward. In heavy fog, they all look the same. Gail did what anyone would do. She kept driving, trying to find her way back to something she recognized. Maybe she pulled over to check a map. Maybe she called someone for directions. We don't know all the details of those hours. What we do know is that at some point, Gail and Heather ended up in Craven County. They were near a small community called Fort Barnwell. It's barely a town, just a scattering of homes and fields near the Neuse River. The Neuse is one of North Carolina's longest rivers. It runs 250 miles from the Piedmont to the coast, winding through forests and farmland before emptying into Pamlico Sound. Near Fort Barnwell, the Neuse is wide, deep, dark, and that morning, it was invisible beneath the fog. The 3 a.m. phone call would haunt everyone who heard about it later. Gail's voice, panicked, desperate. She told her estranged husband that they were in the water, that the van was sinking, that they were drowning. Dale, groggy and confused, tried to make sense of what she was saying. Where was she? What water? How did she get there? But the call was brief, and then it ended. He immediately contacted authorities. Police were able to trace the call to Craven County. They knew, roughly, where it had originated. But roughly doesn't help when you're searching in the dark for 2 people who might be trapped in a submerged vehicle. Searchers were dispatched immediately. They focused on the area around Fort Barnwell, near the Neuse River. They checked roads. They looked for tire marks, broken guardrails, disturbed vegetation, anything that might indicate where a vehicle had left the road. They found nothing. The fog that morning made the search almost impossible. Even in daylight, visibility was poor. Searchers couldn't see more than a few feet in front of them. The river, swollen from recent rains, moved silently past. They searched the same area 3 times that day. 3 times, they came up empty. By evening, Gail Haddockdale and Lynn Roberts were officially missing. Word spread quickly through Kinston. In a town that size, everyone knows someone. And Gail and Heather weren't strangers. People knew Heather's story. They'd read about her in the newspaper, heard about her on the radio. Some had bought the book. Some had even met her. Family members gathered. They made calls. They tried to retrace Gail's likely route, tried to figure out where she might have gone off course. But nothing made sense. If Gail had called from Craven County, why were they there at all? Kinston to Roanoke doesn't take you through Fort Barnwell. You'd have to be significantly lost to end up in that area. And if the van had gone into the water, if they drowned, as Gail said on the phone, why couldn't anyone find the vehicle? The Neuse River wasn't small, but it also wasn't the ocean. A van doesn't just disappear, does it? The first 48 hours of any missing persons case are critical. Statistically, if someone isn't found within that window, the chances of a positive outcome drop sharply. Police know this. Families know this. Everyone feels the clock ticking. Search teams expanded their efforts. Volunteers from the community joined law enforcement. They spread out along the roads between Kinston and Craven County. They checked ditches, wooded areas, side roads. They knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen a dark Dodge Caravan, a woman and a teenage girl. No one had. Divers were brought in to search sections of the Neuse River near Fort Barnwell. The water was murky, the current strong. Visibility underwater was almost zero. Divers worked by feel, sweeping their hands through the silt and debris at the river bottom. They found nothing. Searchers returned to the same stretches of river again and again. They used sonar. They dragged the riverbed. They checked tributaries and creeks that fed into the Neuse. Still nothing. The van, it seemed, had simply ceased to exist. As days became weeks, the case began to shift. At first, authorities and family members held on to hope that this was a miscommunication. Maybe Gail's call had been misunderstood. Maybe they'd broken down somewhere remote and were waiting for help. Maybe Heather's medical needs had required an unexpected hospital stop. But as more time passed without any sign of them, without any use of Gail's credit cards or phone, without any sightings, hope started to give way to something darker. Fear. Not just fear that they were dead. That was awful enough. But fear that something worse had happened. In small towns, when 2 people vanish without a trace, people talk. And the talk turns quickly to the worst possibilities. Had they been abducted? Was this foul play? Gail's estranged husband, Dale, became a person of interest. Not a suspect exactly, but someone investigators needed to talk to. The phone call had come to him, after all. He was one of the last people to hear from Gail. He cooperated fully, answered every question. But the cloud of suspicion, however faint, lingered. Because when there are no answers, suspicion fills the void. Christmas came and went. Heather's 16th birthday, January 21st, passed unmarked. The search continued, but it became less intense. Fewer volunteers, fewer news stories, fewer updates. This is what happens to missing persons cases when the trail goes cold. They don't disappear from official records, but they fade from public consciousness. Life moves on for everyone except the people left behind. Gail's family waited. They kept Heather's room exactly as she'd left it. They saved voicemails. They refused to use the past tense when talking about her. They didn't plan a funeral, because to plan a funeral would be to admit they were gone. And without bodies, without evidence, without closure, how could they admit that? But the river knew. The Neuse, silent and indifferent, moved past Fort Barnwell the same way it had for centuries. It carried rainfall from the Piedmont toward the sea. It rose and fell with the seasons. It hid what rested at its bottom. 16 feet down, in the dark, in the silt and mud, the van waited. Inside, Gail and Heather waited too. Winter turned to spring. Spring became summer. And still, no one knew where they were. There's a particular kind of waiting that happens when someone you love is missing. It's not passive. It's an active, exhausting state of vigilance. Every phone call might be the one. Every knock on the door. Every car that slows down in front of the house. You don't eat properly. You don't sleep. You exist in a perpetual state of bracing yourself for news you both desperately want and desperately fear. For Heather's family, this waiting stretched through the winter of 2004 and into 2005. In missing persons cases, investigators work with what they call risk assessment. They evaluate how vulnerable the missing person is. Age, health, mental state, circumstances of disappearance. Heather was 15 with significant medical needs. She couldn't survive long without her medications, without care. Gail was her caretaker, but Gail was also the one who'd made the panic call, which meant something had gone catastrophically wrong for both of them. The risk assessment was clear: high vulnerability, urgent timeline. But urgent timelines don't matter when you can't find the people you're looking for. Law enforcement continued their investigation through methods the public never sees. They pulled Gail's phone records, looking for patterns. They checked her bank accounts for any activity. They interviewed family members, friends, neighbors. They asked uncomfortable questions about Gail's personal life, her relationships, her state of mind. Was she having financial problems? Relationship problems? Had she seemed depressed, anxious, unlike herself? The answers painted a picture of a woman living a quiet, unremarkable life. She cared for her granddaughter. She went to church. She wrote her book about Heather's experiences with angels. She maintained contact with her estranged husband, though they lived separately. There were no red flags. No indication that she'd planned to disappear, that she was in danger from anyone, that she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a grandmother taking her granddaughter on a trip, which made their disappearance even more inexplicable. In Kinston, people struggled to make sense of it. The Precious Moments community, collectors who'd followed Heather's story, who'd sent her figurines and letters, organized prayer vigils. They posted on message boards, shared information, kept Heather's story alive in their circles. Local churches held services, candlelight gatherings where people who'd never met Heather came to show support, to bear witness, to do something in the face of helplessness. Because that's what missing persons cases do to communities. They create a collective anxiety, an unresolved story that everyone becomes part of, whether they want to be or not. And in small communities, everyone knows the families involved. Someone's cousin, someone's coworker, someone's neighbor. The disappearance wasn't an abstract tragedy. It was personal. But as winter turned to spring, something inevitable began to happen. The intensity faded, not because people stopped caring, but because human beings can't maintain that level of emotional arousal indefinitely. Life asserts itself. Bills need to be paid. Jobs need to be done. Children need to be fed. The search crews came out less frequently. The media coverage slowed. The case remained open, officially active, but it moved to the background. Detectives still worked on it. They followed up on tips, pursued leads. But there weren't many leads to pursue. How do you investigate a disappearance when you have no crime scene, no witnesses, no body, no evidence of anything except a phone call in the dark? Theories filled the vacuum left by facts. Some people believed Gail and Heather were still alive somewhere, that they'd chosen to disappear, to start over. Maybe Gail had been overwhelmed by Heather's care needs. Maybe she'd snapped, driven away, assumed a new identity. It was an appealing theory in some ways, because if they'd chosen to leave, they could choose to come back. Or at least, they were alive somewhere. Other theories were darker. In any case involving an estranged spouse, suspicion naturally falls there first. Glenn Dale had been cooperative, had provided alibis, had passed every question investigators asked. But suspicion isn't rational. It lingers even when there's no evidence to support it. Some people whispered about abduction. Rural highways, two vulnerable people, the wrong place at the wrong time. Trafficking. Murder. Bodies hidden somewhere they'd never be found. These theories spread in church parking lots, in grocery store aisles, in the quiet conversations people have when something terrible happens and no one knows how to process it. The theories didn't help, but they gave people a way to talk about the unspeakable. Meanwhile, the Neuse River flowed on. In spring, the river swells with runoff. Rain from the Piedmont travels down through tributaries and creeks, all of it eventually feeding into the Neuse. The water level rises. The current strengthens. Near Fort Barnwell, the river is wide enough that you can't see across it in some places. The banks are lined with cypress trees, their roots visible above the waterline like skeletal hands. It's beautiful in an ancient, indifferent way. And somewhere beneath that surface, 16 feet down, Gale's van rested in the silt. The current moved past it. Fish swam through the broken windows. Sediment slowly accumulated around the tires. The river, patient and implacable, kept its secret. Summer came. June brought heat that settled over eastern North Carolina like a wet blanket. The humidity made everything heavy. Clothes stuck to skin. Even breathing felt like work. Heather should have been planning for her junior year of high school. Should have been thinking about driver's permits, part-time jobs, all the small milestones that mark the journey from childhood to adulthood. Instead, her room remained frozen in time, exactly as she'd left it 7 months earlier. Her family couldn't bring themselves to change anything. The Precious Moments figurines still lined the shelves. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her books, her drawings, her collection of angel-themed items, all untouched. To disturb them would be to acknowledge something they weren't ready to acknowledge. In law enforcement, there's a phenomenon that occurs in long-term missing persons cases. It's not official. It's not discussed openly. But it happens. The case becomes cold not because anyone decides to stop working it, but because there's simply nowhere else to look. Every lead has been followed. Every witness interviewed. Every piece of physical evidence examined. You can't search the same river section 100 times and expect different results. Investigators don't give up, but their attention shifts to cases where they can actually make progress. Cases with suspects, evidence, actionable leads. Gale and Heather's case didn't have any of those things. It had a phone call, a general location, and nothing else. By August, it had been 8 months. 8 months of not knowing. 8 months of hope and despair cycling endlessly. 8 months of every phone ring being a potential answer and a potential confirmation of the worst. The human mind isn't built to sustain that kind of uncertainty. Psychologists call it ambiguous loss. It's a unique kind of grief. The person is gone, but there's no body, no funeral, no ritual of closure. You can't mourn completely because there's always the possibility, however remote, that they might come back. It's a grief that doesn't resolve. It just continues. Heather's family existed in that space. Unable to move forward. Unable to go back. Suspended. And then September came. The weather began to shift. The oppressive heat broke. Cooler air moved in from the north. The leaves on the hardwood trees started their slow transformation from green to gold to red. Fall in North Carolina is gorgeous. The light changes. Everything feels crisper, clearer. But for Heather's family, the changing season just marked another milestone. Another period of time she'd been gone. Another set of holidays approaching that would be unbearable. Halloween. Thanksgiving. Christmas again. December 7th, 2005 would mark exactly 1 year since that foggy morning when Gale and Heather left for Roanoke. 1 full year of absence. In early October, something happened that had nothing to do with the case. A man was fishing on the Neuse River near Fort Barnwell. It's a popular spot. The river is deep there, and the fish are plentiful. People fish from the banks, from boats, from the bridge that spans the water. This particular man was in a boat. He was using sonar to locate fish. Sonar works by sending sound waves down into the water and measuring what bounces back. Different objects return different signals. The riverbed has one signature. Fish have another. Large objects, submerged logs, old tires, debris, have distinct signatures too. On this October day, the man's sonar picked up something. A large object, sitting on the bottom of the river in about 16 feet of water. The signature was unusual, too regular to be natural, too big to be typical river debris. He marked the location, and then he made a call. Recovery operations in rivers are complicated. The water is murky. Visibility is near zero. Divers work essentially blind, navigating by feel and experience. The current complicates everything, and you never know what you're going to find. Sometimes it's nothing. An old boat that sank years ago. A refrigerator someone dumped. The river collects things, but sometimes it's something else. The dive team that entered the Neuse River on October 13, 2005 went down expecting to investigate an anomaly on sonar. What they found instead was a dark Dodge Caravan, resting upright on the river bottom. Intact. Windows down. Doors closed. And inside, there are moments in an investigation when everything changes. When the case you've been working on suddenly shifts from missing persons to recovery. From hoping for the best to confirming the worst. This was that moment. The divers surfaced. They reported what they'd found. And within hours, the riverbank near Fort Barnwell filled with emergency vehicles, investigators, equipment. The media, which had moved on months ago, returned. And Heather's family received the call they'd been dreading for 10 months. We found them. The recovery process took time. Extracting a vehicle from 16 feet of water isn't simple. The van had to be secured, lifted carefully to avoid disturbing whatever might be inside. The current made everything more difficult. But eventually, Gail's Dodge Caravan was pulled from the Neuse River and placed on the bank. Water poured from the doors as they were opened. Inside, still in their seats after nearly a year in the water, were Gail Haddockdale and Heather Lynn Roberts. The medical examiner would later confirm what everyone already knew. They drowned. Almost certainly soon after the van entered the water. Almost certainly on the morning of December 7, 2004. They'd been there the entire time. Right where searchers had looked. Right where divers had searched. Right where authorities had focused their efforts in those first desperate days after the phone call. They'd been there all along. The question everyone asked was simple and terrible. How? How does a van sit in a river for 10 months while people search for it repeatedly and no one finds it? The answer was a combination of factors. Each one small. Each one understandable. But together, they added up to tragedy. First, the fog on December 7th had been dense. Visibility was almost zero in places. Gail, lost and disoriented, had apparently driven off the road at a point where there was no guardrail. The van had entered the water without leaving obvious signs on the roadway. Second, the river depth. 16 feet is deep enough that the van was completely submerged. From the surface, especially in murky water, it would have been invisible. Third, the timing of searches. The initial searches had focused on the area, but sonar equipment isn't perfect. The van could have been missed in those first sweeps, especially if searchers weren't looking in exactly the right spot. Fourth, the fog had obscured the exact location of Gail's phone call. The general area was known, but not the precise spot. In a river as long and winding as the Neuse, general area meant miles of potential search zone. And finally, the current and silt. Over time, the van had settled into the river bottom. Sediment accumulated around it. It became part of the landscape down there, just another dark shape in the darkness. These weren't excuses, just explanations. The searches had been thorough. The effort had been genuine. The investigators hadn't been negligent. Sometimes the world just conspires in terrible ways. The news hit Kinston hard. For 10 months, there had been hope. Unrealistic, maybe. Fading, certainly. But hope nonetheless. Now there was only grief. Real, confirmed, unavoidable grief. The memorial services were held in November 2005. 2 services, actually. One for Gail. One for Heather. The church was packed for both. People came who'd searched for them. Who'd prayed for them. Who'd kept their story alive through the long months of waiting. They came to say goodbye. Heather was buried in Craven County, not far from the river that had taken her. Her headstone included her dates, January 21st, 1989 to December 7th, 2004. 15 years. Not nearly enough. The Precious Moments figurine, the one created from her dream, the one showing the little girl with teardrop eyes holding angels and kittens, took on a different meaning now. It had been meant as a message of hope. A reminder that suffering leads to peace, that heaven awaits those who believe. After Heather's death, it became a memorial. A way for collectors and strangers alike to remember a girl they'd never met, but whose story had touched them. Some people found comfort in that. The idea that Heather's dream had been prophetic, that she was, in fact, in heaven with her angels and her kittens. Others found it unbearably sad. A 15-year-old shouldn't have to dream about dying to find peace. But there was something else about the recovery that stayed with the people who were there that day. The van had been found less than half a mile from where the initial searches had focused. Less than half a mile. In one sense, that's nothing. A tiny distance. If the first sonar sweep had covered just a slightly larger area, if the divers had gone just a little further, if the weather had been just a bit clearer, they might have been found immediately. Gail's phone call might have saved them instead of becoming their epitaph. But in another sense, half a mile might as well have been infinity, because they weren't found then. They were found 10 months later. And by that time, it was far too late. The aftermath of a tragedy like this doesn't end when the bodies are recovered. In some ways, that's when it really begins. Because now the questions shift. From where are they, to how did this happen? And more importantly, could it have been prevented? Those questions don't have comfortable answers. The official investigation into the accident was straightforward. Gail Haddock-Dale had been driving in heavy fog on the morning of December 7, 2004. She'd become lost, disoriented. At some point near Fort Barnwell, she'd left the roadway and entered the Neuse River. The exact location was a rural stretch where the road ran close to the water. There was no guardrail at that particular spot. No barrier between asphalt and river. In good weather, the edge would have been obvious. But in dense fog, with visibility near zero, the distinction between road and riverbank would have been impossible to see. The van had entered the water. Whether it went in fast or slow, straight or at an angle, these details were lost to the river. What investigators could determine was that the van had sunk quickly. The windows were down, which meant water had poured in rapidly. Within minutes, probably, maybe seconds, Gail had made the call to her husband sometime during this, either as the van was going in or immediately after. That much was clear from the call logs. But then the call ended, and the river claimed them both. Accidental drownings are more common than most people realize. In the United States, thousands of people drown each year. Many of those deaths happen in circumstances that seem, in hindsight, easily preventable. A moment of distraction, a miscalculation, a small error that cascades into catastrophe. Vehicle submersions are particularly deadly. When a car enters water, most people panic. That's natural. But panic uses oxygen, clouds judgment, makes it harder to think clearly about what to do next. The advice from safety experts is consistent. Stay calm, open the window immediately, get out before the car sinks. But that advice assumes you have time, that you're conscious, that you're not injured, that your passenger, especially a passenger with medical needs, can move quickly. In reality, when a vehicle hits water, everything happens fast, and nothing goes according to plan. For Heather's family, the official conclusion, accidental drowning, should have brought closure. It wasn't murder. It wasn't abduction. It wasn't any of the dark scenarios that had haunted them for 10 months. It was an accident. A terrible, tragic accident. But closure is complicated. Because alongside the relief of finally knowing came a different kind of pain. The pain of proximity. They'd been so close. Searchers had been in the right area within hours of the disappearance. Divers had been in that same section of river multiple times. If the searches had been just slightly different. If the equipment had been just a bit more sensitive. If the fog had lifted an hour earlier. If. Those two letters became a kind of torture. In the weeks after the recovery, there was quiet talk about the search operation itself. Not criticism exactly. Everyone understood that searchers had done their best under difficult conditions. The fog, the vast area to cover, the limitations of the equipment, all of it made the search incredibly challenging. But there were questions. Should the river have been searched more thoroughly initially? Should more resources have been deployed? Should different techniques have been used? These weren't accusations. Just questions that hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Because you can't rewrite the past. You can only learn from it. One detail from the recovery stayed with investigators. The windows of the van had been down. Not broken. Not damaged. Down. Which suggested that at some point, either before the van entered the water or during, Gail had rolled them down. Perhaps she'd been trying to let fog out, to clear the windshield. Perhaps she'd wanted fresh air. Or perhaps, in those final moments, she'd opened them trying to escape. The thought of that, of Gail, realizing what was happening, trying frantically to save herself and Heather, was almost unbearable. But it was also a reminder of something important. She'd fought. In those last moments, she hadn't given up. She'd made a phone call. She'd tried to get help. She'd probably tried everything she could think of to get them out of that van. It hadn't been enough. But she'd tried. The phone call itself became a subject of discussion. Gail had called her estranged husband, Glenn, at approximately 3 in the morning. The call had been brief. Panicked. She'd said they were in the water, that they were drowning. And then the call had ended. The question people asked was, why call him? They were estranged, living separately. They weren't divorced, but they weren't together either. Why would he be her first call in an emergency? The answer, probably, was simple: muscle memory. In a crisis, people revert to patterns. Gail and Glenn had been married for years. He'd been her person, the one she called when things went wrong. Even though their relationship had changed, that instinct remained. So in the darkest moment of her life, disoriented and terrified, she called the person she'd always called. It made sense in a sad, human way. For Glendale, the recovery brought its own complicated emotions. For 10 months, he'd lived under a shadow of suspicion. Nothing explicit, nothing he could point to directly. But he'd felt it in the way people looked at him, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. The spouse is always a suspect, even when there's no evidence. Even when logic says otherwise. Now, with the cause of death confirmed as accidental, that suspicion should have evaporated. But suspicion doesn't disappear cleanly. It leaves residue. Some people still wondered, still whispered, still harbored doubts they couldn't quite articulate, but couldn't quite release either. For Glenn, the vindication of the accident ruling came too late to undo 10 months of quiet judgment. In Kinston, the memorial services for Gail and Heather drew hundreds of people. Some had known them personally. Others had followed the case through the media. Still others came simply because they needed to bear witness, to be part of the community's collective grief. The services focused on celebration of life rather than circumstances of death. People spoke about Gail's dedication to Heather, about the book she'd written, about her faith and her strength. They spoke about Heather's resilience, about surviving a house fire that should have killed her, about her talks with angels, about her gentle nature and her collection of precious moments figurines. They spoke about a grandmother and granddaughter who'd loved each other deeply, who'd been each other's constant companions. The tears were real. The grief was profound. But there was also, for some, a sense of peace. Not because the outcome was acceptable, it wasn't, but because the uncertainty had ended. Because they could finally mourn properly instead of existing in that terrible liminal space of not knowing. The Precious Moments community responded to Heather's death in a way that surprised even those familiar with the tight-knit collector world. Tributes poured in from across the country. People who'd never met Heather but who'd followed her story, who'd been moved by her book, who'd sent her figurines over the years. Some collectors created memorial displays, arrangements of Precious Moments pieces dedicated to Heather's memory. The company itself issued a statement acknowledging Heather's passing and noting her special place in the Precious Moments story. For a community built around ceramic figurines with teardrop eyes, the symbolism was almost too perfect. Those tears, originally meant to represent childlike emotion and tenderness, now represented real grief. But perhaps the most difficult aftermath belonged to the searchers themselves. The volunteers who'd given up days and weeks of their lives looking for Gail and Heather. The divers who'd gone into the murky Neuse River again and again. The law enforcement officers who'd coordinated the efforts. They'd done everything right. Followed protocol. Used available resources. Worked tirelessly. And still, they'd failed to find them when it might have mattered. Rationally, everyone understood it wasn't their fault. The conditions had been impossible. The area too large. The limitations too significant. But rationality doesn't protect against guilt. Some of the searchers struggled with it, replayed their efforts in their minds, wondering if they'd missed something obvious. Second-guessing decisions made in good faith under pressure. One diver later spoke about it publicly. He described going back to the exact spot where the van was eventually found and realizing he'd probably swum within feet of it during the initial search. He'd been that close. But in 16 feet of murky water, with zero visibility, a few feet might as well have been miles. He knew, intellectually, that he couldn't have done anything differently. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. In the months following the recovery, there were discussions about infrastructure improvements. The stretch of road where Gail's van had entered the water had no guardrail. It wasn't unique in that regard. Many rural roads in North Carolina lacked barriers between roadway and water. The cost of installing guardrails along every such stretch would have been prohibitive. Millions of dollars. And for what return? How many accidents actually occurred at these specific locations? It was a cost-benefit analysis. Cold, pragmatic, necessary. But for Heather's family, it was also a reminder that her death hadn't been inevitable. That with different infrastructure, different safety measures, she might still be alive. Eventually, some improvements were made to that particular stretch. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time, modest changes were implemented. It was something. Not enough, but something. The question of Heather's medical needs also hung in the background. She'd required multiple medications, regular care, attention that her grandmother provided lovingly, but that also represented a significant responsibility. Some people wondered, quietly, whether the stress of that care had contributed to what happened. Whether Gail had been tired, distracted, overwhelmed. There was no evidence of that. No indication that Gail had been anything other than fully capable and committed to Heather's well-being. But in the absence of a clear villain, because what villain exists in an accident? People sometimes look for fault anyway. Some pattern of negligence to explain the inexplicable. The truth is simpler and more terrible. Sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason other than bad luck and bad timing. By the time 2006 arrived, life in Kinston had mostly returned to normal. The case was closed. The bodies were buried. The memorial services were over. People still thought about Heather and Gail, still mentioned them occasionally, but the intense, consuming focus had faded. That's what happens with tragedy in small communities. It burns bright and hot, then slowly banks to embers. Not because people stop caring, but because life demands attention. Bills, jobs, children, daily responsibilities. All of it continues regardless of grief. For Heather's family, though, the grief remained acute. They'd lost not just Heather, but also Gail. Two people they loved, gone in an instant. And for 10 months, they'd existed in agony, not knowing. Now they knew. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. If anything, knowing made it worse. Because now they could picture it. The fog, the confusion, the van entering the water, the panic, the final moments. Sometimes not knowing is a mercy. The book Gail had written, Talks with Angels, took on a new significance after her death. It had been published as an inspirational story, a testimony of faith, a chronicle of Heather's medical journey and her spiritual experiences. After the accident, readers returned to it with different eyes. They found passages that seemed eerily prescient. Heather's descriptions of heaven, her certainty that she would go there soon, her dreams about angels and peace and being reunited with her kittens. Some readers found this comforting. Proof, they said, that Heather had known her destiny, that she'd been prepared, that her death was part of a larger plan. Others found it deeply unsettling. Because what kind of world requires a 15-year-old to be prepared for death? The book had never been a bestseller, but it had found its audience, particularly among precious moments collectors and people in faith communities. After Heather's death, it became something else, a memorial. A way to remember her not just as a victim but as a person who'd lived, who'd had thoughts and dreams, and a unique perspective on the world. There's a particular cruelty to accidents that happen in fog. Because fog is temporary. It lifts. The world clarifies. What was invisible becomes obvious. On December 7, 2004, the fog that disoriented Gail eventually cleared. By afternoon, visibility was normal. The roads she'd been unable to navigate in the morning were perfectly clear by evening. If she'd waited, if she'd pulled over and stayed put until the fog lifted, if she'd delayed the trip by just a few hours. But she didn't know. How could she? She was trying to reach her brother's house for Christmas. She was doing something ordinary, something she'd done before. There was no reason to expect catastrophe. And that's what makes accidents so terrifying. They don't announce themselves. They don't give warnings. They happen in the middle of normal life, turning routine into tragedy in seconds. The Neuse River, indifferent to all of this, continued its ancient journey from the Piedmont to the sea. It carried rainfall and sediment. It flooded in spring and receded in summer. Fish spawned in its shallows. Herons hunted along its banks. At the spot where Gail's van had rested for 10 months, there was nothing to mark what had happened. No memorial. No sign. Just water flowing over riverbed, the same as it had for millennia. Eventually, some of Heather's family visited the location, stood on the bank and looked at the water and tried to process what had happened there. It's hard to reconcile the peaceful scene, trees reflected in dark water, birds calling, the quiet flow of current, with the violence of what occurred. But that's always the case with sites of tragedy. They don't look like what they are. The world doesn't change. Only the people do. In the years since 2005, the case has occasionally resurfaced in local memory. When someone mentions missing persons searches, someone else inevitably brings up Heather and Gail. When there's discussion of rural road safety, their names come up. They've become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how fog and unfamiliar roads and a momentary disorientation can lead to irreversible consequences. But they've also become more than that. They've become a reminder of resilience, of Heather's remarkable survival through a house fire and years of medical challenges, of Gail's dedication to caring for her granddaughter, of a community that searched tirelessly even when the search seemed hopeless. Tragedies don't have to have lessons. But if there's anything to learn from this one, it might be simply this. Life is fragile. Love matters. And sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, terrible things happen anyway. There's a moment in every tragedy when the public narrative solidifies. The facts become established. The timeline becomes fixed. The story acquires a shape that people can hold on to, repeat, remember. For Heather and Gail, that narrative was simple. Grandmother and granddaughter, lost in fog, drowned in a tragic accident. But narratives, even true ones, leave things out. They compress complexity into digestible form. They smooth over the rough edges, the contradictions, the parts that don't fit neatly. And in doing so, they sometimes miss what matters most. One thing the official narrative didn't dwell on was Heather's medical history. Not because it was irrelevant, but because it was painful, complicated, difficult to discuss without seeming exploitative. Heather had been born with multiple congenital conditions. Her survival through infancy had been uncertain. Doctors had told her family to prepare for the worst. She'd proven them wrong. Then came the house fire when she was 8. Third-degree burns over significant portions of her body. Months of hospitalization, surgeries, skin grafts, pain that most adults couldn't imagine enduring, much less a child. She'd survived that too. Through it all, according to those who knew her, Heather maintained a gentleness, a sweetness, an ability to find joy in small things, a new figurine, a visit with friends, time with her grandmother. Her talks with angels had started after the fire. Whether they were genuine spiritual experiences, trauma responses, dreams given meaning through faith, or something else entirely, that's not for anyone else to judge. What mattered was that they gave Heather comfort. They gave her a framework for understanding her suffering. They gave her hope. And in the end, they gave her grandmother material for a book that would preserve Heather's voice after she was gone. The relationship between Gail and Heather was central to everything. Gail had essentially raised Heather. Not because Heather's parents were absent, though the details of that arrangement were private, kept within the family, but because Heather's needs required constant, devoted care. Gail had provided that care for 15 years. 15 years of doctor's appointments and medications, of advocacy and patience, of sleepless nights and worry, of love that showed up in countless small acts of service. Caregiving at that level is exhausting. It's all-consuming. It's also, for many people, deeply meaningful. Gail's identity had become intertwined with caring for Heather. She was Heather's grandmother, yes, but she was also Heather's advocate, her protector, her constant companion. When they died together, it was in some ways fitting, not in the sense that it should have happened, but in the sense that they'd been inseparable in life. They'd shared everything, including, ultimately, the end. But there was something else about their relationship that people who knew them noticed. Heather had never really had a normal childhood, not because of neglect or lack of love, but because chronic illness and disability don't allow for normal. They impose their own rhythms, their own limitations, their own realities. While other kids her age were going to parties, joining sports teams, navigating typical teenage dramas, Heather was managing medical appointments and physical therapy and the daily realities of living in a body that required constant maintenance. She'd made friends, but friendships were complicated when your life looked so different from everyone else's. She'd had dreams and interests, her precious moments collection, her faith, her writing about angels, but they were shaped by her circumstances in ways both beautiful and heartbreaking. In the book Talks with Angels, Heather's voice came through. And what struck readers was her maturity, her acceptance, her lack of bitterness about the hand she'd been dealt. She didn't sound like a typical teenager. She sounded like someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast, to make peace with realities that most people her age never had to confront. The day they left for Roanoke, December 7th, 2004, should have been an escape from routine. A trip to see family, an early Christmas celebration, a chance to get out of Kinston, to break the pattern of doctors' offices and home and church and back again. Gail had planned it carefully, made sure they had everything Heather would need. Medications packed, comfortable clothes, probably some precious moments figurines to show her brother, to share that part of Heather's world with extended family. It was supposed to be joyful. Instead, it became the last day of their lives. The fog that morning was unusual even for December in eastern North Carolina. Meteorologists later analyzed the conditions. A combination of temperature, humidity, and stagnant air had created what's called radiation fog, the kind that forms overnight when the ground cools rapidly and water vapor condenses near the surface. It's thick, patchy, unpredictable. In some areas that morning, visibility was normal. 100 yards later, you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Then it would clear again, only to thicken once more around the next bend. Driving in those conditions is disorienting. Your usual reference points disappear. Road signs emerge from whiteness when you're already past them. Other vehicles appear suddenly, their taillights glowing red in the murk. It's dangerous. And experienced drivers know to slow down, pull over if necessary, wait it out. But Gail was trying to reach Roanoke. She had a schedule. She probably thought she could navigate through it. And for a while, she probably did. Until she couldn't. The exact sequence of events near Fort Barnwell will never be fully known. What investigators could piece together was this. Gail had gotten lost. She'd ended up on roads she didn't recognize, in an area she wasn't familiar with. The fog made it impossible to orient herself. At some point, she'd pulled out her cell phone, made a call, or tried to make one, attempting to get help, to get directions, to figure out where she was. The phone records showed activity, but not much. Just a few attempts, a few brief connections. Then, somewhere on a rural road near the Neuse River, the van left the pavement. It might have been a wrong turn. She might have thought she was turning onto another road, but was actually turning toward the river. In the fog, the distinction would have been impossible to see. Or it might have been that she drifted off the road slightly, overcorrecting, hitting soft shoulder, the van pulling toward the water before she could stop it. Or it might have been even simpler. She stopped, thinking she'd pulled to the side of the road safely, not realizing how close to the edge she was. And when she put the van in gear again, it rolled forward into the water. However it happened, the result was the same. The van entered the Neuse River. Submersion happens faster than most people expect. A vehicle entering water doesn't float for long. As soon as water starts entering, through open windows, through the undercarriage, through any opening, the weight increases dramatically. Modern vehicles have some buoyancy initially, but it's temporary, measured in seconds or at most a few minutes. During that brief window, the people inside have to make critical decisions under extreme pressure. Get out immediately. Don't try to save belongings. Don't waste time. Just get out. But that assumes you're conscious, uninjured, able to move quickly, thinking clearly despite the panic. For Gail, there were additional complications. Heather couldn't evacuate the van on her own. Her physical limitations meant she needed help, needed time, needed assistance that, in a rapidly sinking vehicle, Gail couldn't provide. So Gail had to choose. And really, it wasn't a choice at all. She stayed with Heather. The call to Glenn came during this, either as the van was entering the water or immediately after. Gail's voice on the phone, panicked, desperate, saying they were drowning. It must have been chaos. Water pouring in. Heather terrified. Gail trying to call for help, while simultaneously trying to figure out how to save them. The human brain, under that kind of stress, doesn't function normally. Adrenaline floods the system. Fine motor control degrades. Rational thought becomes difficult. Gail made the call. She got through. She conveyed the emergency. But she couldn't give her location. Because she didn't know her location. She'd been lost even before the van went into the water. And then the call ended. Whether the phone stopped working, whether the battery died, whether Gail simply couldn't hold on to it anymore, we don't know. What we know is that after that brief, desperate call, there was silence. The water in the Neuse River that December morning was cold. Not freezing. This is North Carolina, not Minnesota, but cold enough. In the 50s, probably. Cold enough to shock the system, to make breathing difficult, to accelerate the physical effects of drowning. And the water was dark. Even in daylight, the Neuse is murky. Tannins from decaying vegetation give it a tea-colored opacity. You can't see more than a few inches below the surface even in the clearest conditions. Inside a sinking van, with water pouring through the windows, in near total darkness, the disorientation would have been complete. Gail and Heather would have had no reference points. No way to tell which way was up. No way to see the doors or windows or any potential escape route. Just cold, dark water filling the space around them. And then, within minutes, probably less than 5, it was over. Drowning is not like it appears in movies. There's rarely violent thrashing. Often, there's very little sound. People who are truly drowning are using all their energy just trying to breathe. They can't call for help. They can't wave their arms. They can't do anything except try desperately to keep their faces above water. And once water enters the lungs, the body's response is swift. The airway spasms. Oxygen levels drop. Consciousness fades within a minute or two. Death follows quickly. For Heather, given her medical conditions, the process might have been even faster. For Gail, watching her granddaughter die, unable to save her, those final moments must have been hell beyond description. But eventually, for both of them, there was nothing. Just darkness and silence and the cold embrace of the river. The van settled on the bottom 16 feet down. The current pushed against it initially, but the vehicle's weight kept it in place. Gradually, sediment began to accumulate around the tires. Aquatic plants started growing on the surfaces. Small fish moved in and out through the open windows. The river reclaimed it, made it part of the landscape. And there it sat. Through winter, through spring, through summer, through the first cool days of autumn. While up above, on land, people searched and wondered and grieved and hoped and eventually despaired. The van kept it secret. The divers who eventually found it in October 2005 were professionals. They'd done recovery operations before. They understood what they might find. They'd mentally prepared themselves. But there's a difference between intellectual preparation and visceral reality. Opening that van, seeing 2 bodies that had been in the water for 10 months. The decomposition, the damage, the way water transforms human remains into something almost unrecognizable. One of the divers later described it in a single word: haunting. Not just because of what he saw, but because of what it represented. 2 people who'd called for help, who'd been searched for intensively, who'd been right there the entire time, waiting to be found. The recovery team worked with professionalism and respect. They treated Gail and Heather with dignity, even in death. They extracted them carefully, conscious that these weren't just bodies but people. Someone's grandmother, someone's granddaughter, someone's loved ones. The medical examiner's report confirmed the obvious: cause of death was drowning. Time of death was estimated as December 7, 2004, based on the known timeline and the condition of the remains. There was no evidence of foul play. No injuries inconsistent with a vehicle accident. No signs that anyone else had been involved. It was, officially and definitively, a tragic accident. But the report also noted something else. Something that stayed with the people who read it. Gail and Heather had been found still in their seats. Still seatbelted. Which meant they'd never made it out of the van. Never reached the windows. Never had a chance to swim to the surface. They died where they sat. Together. In the darkness. In the days following the recovery, there was media coverage. Local news primarily, though some regional outlets picked up the story. The angle was mostly the same. Missing persons case finally solved, tragic accident, community mourns. But some reporters dug deeper. They interviewed family members, talked to searchers, tried to understand how the van could have been missed for so long. Those stories raised uncomfortable questions about search protocols, about resource allocation, about whether more could have been done. Law enforcement defended their efforts. And they were right to. The search had been thorough given the conditions and available resources. But thorough and successful aren't the same thing. The van had been there. It could have been found sooner. And if it had been, well, that's the thought that haunted everyone involved. The terrible hypothetical that can never be answered. Heather's bedroom remained unchanged for a long time after her death. Her family couldn't bring themselves to pack it up, couldn't sort through her belongings, decide what to keep and what to donate and what to discard. Everything in that room had been touched by her. Everything held memory. The precious moments figurines on the shelves, each one representing a gift from someone, a moment in time, a connection to the larger community that had embraced her story. The books on angels, the stuffed animals, the clothes in the closet that she'd never wear again. All of it frozen, preserved. A shrine, essentially, to a girl who'd survived so much and deserved so much more time. Eventually, months later, maybe years, the room would be cleared. Not forgotten, but released. Transformed from a memorial into a space that could serve the living. But not yet. Not for a long time yet. Grief is not linear. It doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't respect calendars or anniversaries or the well-meaning advice of people who say that time heals all wounds. For Heather's family, the first year after the recovery was a succession of terrible firsts. The first Christmas without them. The first time Heather's birthday passed unmarked by her presence. The first anniversary of the accident. Each milestone arrived like a fresh wound. In Kinston, life continued in the way it always does in small towns. People went to work. Children went to school. The rhythms of daily existence reasserted themselves with relentless normalcy. But for those who'd known Gail and Heather, there were constant reminders. A precious moments display in a store window. A dark-colored van on the highway. The fog that rolled in on winter mornings, thick and disorienting. Even the river itself became different. Not dangerous, exactly, but no longer just a geographical feature. Now it was the place where they'd died. The place that had kept them hidden. The place that had answered the question everyone had been asking, but only after it was far too late to matter. The Precious Moments community struggled with Heather's death in their own way. For collectors, the figurines weren't just porcelain objects. They represented sentiment, memory, connection. Each piece told a story. The figurine inspired by Heather's dream, the little girl with angels and kittens, had been released before her death. Some collectors already owned it. For them, it became retroactively precious in a way nothing else in their collections was. Others sought it out after learning about Heather. They wanted to own a piece of her story, to keep her memory alive in their own small way. The company quietly continued producing the figurine. They never marketed it as a memorial piece. That would have been crass. But everyone understood what it represented. And when collectors displayed it, they often included a small note. A prayer card. A mention of Heather's name. Some acknowledgement that this wasn't just decoration. It was remembrance. The book Talks with Angels found a second life after Heather's death. It had never been widely distributed. Small press. Limited marketing. The kind of book that circulates mostly through word of mouth and niche communities. But after the accident, people sought it out. Some wanted to understand who Heather had been beyond the news reports. Some were looking for comfort, for evidence that her faith had sustained her to the end. Some were simply curious. Reading it after knowing how the story ended gave the text a different weight. Passages that had seemed inspirational now seemed prophetic. Heather's descriptions of heaven, her certainty about angels, her lack of fear regarding death, all of it took on new meaning. One passage in particular struck readers. Heather had described heaven as a place where there was no more pain, no more hospitals, no more surgeries, just peace and joy and the presence of God and the angels she'd been talking to all along. For some readers, this was comforting. The idea that Heather had gotten what she'd been promised, that her suffering had ended, that she was, in some unknowable way, exactly where she'd wanted to be. For others, it was heartbreaking, because Heather shouldn't have had to die at 15 to find peace. She should have had decades, a full life, the chance to experience joy without pain, to grow up, to become whoever she might have been. Both reactions were valid. Both were true. Glendale, Gail's estranged husband, retreated from public view after the recovery. He'd cooperated fully with the investigation. He'd attended the memorial services. He'd done everything that was expected of him. But the weight of that 3 a.m. phone call stayed with him. Hearing his wife's voice, terrified and desperate, being unable to help, not knowing where she was or what was happening. then losing contact and spending the next 10 months wondering if he could have done something different. Could he have kept her on the line? Could he have traced the call faster? Could he have somehow reached them in time? Logically, he knew the answer was no. There was nothing he could have done. The van was already sinking when she called. By the time anyone could have responded, it was over. But logic doesn't prevent guilt. In interviews he gave shortly after the recovery, before he stopped giving interviews altogether, he spoke about that call. How it replayed in his mind constantly. How he could still hear her voice saying they were drowning. Then he stopped talking about it. Stopped talking to reporters entirely. Some traumas are too heavy to carry in public. The search and rescue teams, meanwhile, implemented changes. Not because they'd done anything wrong, but because Heather and Gail's case had exposed limitations in protocols and equipment. Sonar technology improved. Training was updated. Procedures for river searches were refined based on what had been learned. These changes wouldn't help Gail and Heather, but they might help the next family, the next missing person, the next desperate search for someone lost in water. That's the only redemption tragedy offers sometimes. Not justice, not reversal, just the possibility that future suffering might be prevented. Fort Barnwell itself changed very little. It remained a small, quiet community near the river. Most of the people who lived there hadn't known Gail and Heather personally. The accident was a terrible thing that had happened nearby, but it wasn't their tragedy to claim. Still, locals became more aware of the river's dangers. Parents warned children to stay back from the banks. Fishermen were more cautious about where they waded. Drivers on foggy mornings slowed down, remembered what could happen if you lost your bearings for just a moment. The spot where the van had entered the water didn't become a memorial site. There was no marker, no plaque, no flowers left by strangers. It was just a bend in the river. Unremarkable. Indistinguishable from 100 other similar spots along the Neuse. But the people who knew the story knew where it was. And they didn't forget. In the years that followed, Heather's story occasionally resurfaced online. True crime forums, missing persons databases, blogs dedicated to tragic accidents. The narrative became simplified in retelling, as narratives always do. Grandmother and granddaughter. Fog. River. 10 months searching. Finally found. The human details got compressed. The complexity reduced to bullet points. But occasionally, someone would post about the Precious Moments figurine. About the book. About Heather's talks with angels. And for a moment, she'd become three-dimensional again. Not just a victim but a person who'd lived, who'd had interests and faith and a story worth telling. Those posts mattered, because they fought against the tendency of tragedy to erase individuality, to turn people into statistics, into cautionary tales, into plot points in someone else's narrative. Heather had been more than the girl who drowned. She'd been more than her medical conditions. She'd been more than an inspirational story or a tragic ending. She'd been herself, complex and real and irreplaceable. The question of whether Heather's death could have been prevented haunted multiple levels. On the immediate level, could the van have been found sooner during the search? Possibly. With better equipment, better weather, better luck, maybe. On a broader level, could the accident itself have been prevented? Also possibly. With a guardrail on that stretch of road. With Gail choosing to wait out the fog. With any of a dozen small variables aligning differently. But this kind of thinking is a trap. Because you can trace causation back infinitely. If Gail had left 5 minutes earlier or later. If they'd taken a different route. If Heather hadn't needed to visit the doctor the previous week, changing their schedule. If the fog had lifted an hour sooner. At some point, you have to accept that accidents happen at the intersection of chance and circumstance. That prevention isn't always possible. That we live in a world where random factors can combine in terrible ways despite everyone's best intentions. It's an uncomfortable truth, but it's still the truth. Heather's burial site in Craven County became a place of quiet pilgrimage for some. Not many people. Not the crowds that gather at celebrity graves or famous historical sites. Just occasional visitors who'd been touched by her story in some way. They'd leave Precious Moments figurines, small angels, flowers, notes expressing sympathy or sharing their own stories of loss. The cemetery staff would periodically clear these items away. That's their job, to maintain the grounds. But new offerings would appear. A constant, quiet stream of remembrance from strangers who'd never met Heather but felt connected to her nonetheless. There's something both beautiful and sad about that. Beautiful because it shows the human capacity for empathy, for connection across distance and death. Sad because Heather's fame, such as it was, came from suffering and loss rather than from the long, full life she deserved. The house fire that Heather had survived at age 8 remained part of her story even after her death. People would mention it, almost reflexively, when discussing her life, as if surviving one tragedy somehow made the second one more cruel, more unfair. And maybe it did. Heather had already beaten terrible odds. She'd already endured pain most people never face. She'd already demonstrated resilience and strength beyond her years. To survive all of that only to die in a car accident, in some ways, it felt like a cosmic joke. A universe that gives you back your life once, lets you think you've earned a future, then takes it away anyway. But the universe doesn't work on fairness. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't owe anyone anything. Heather survived the fire because of medical intervention, because of luck, because of her own will to live. She died in the river for equally random, equally meaningless reasons. There's no grand narrative connecting the two events. No lesson. No arc of justice or injustice. Just a girl who lived through extraordinary circumstances and then, tragically, didn't. Gail's role as a caregiver didn't receive enough attention in the aftermath. The focus, understandably, was on Heather, the young victim, the girl with the inspiring story, the one who'd talked to angels. But Gail had been remarkable too. 15 years of caring for a child with complex medical needs. 15 years of doctors and hospitals and insurance battles and sleepless nights. 15 years of advocating and protecting and loving fiercely. Caregivers often become invisible in narratives about illness and disability. They're the supporting cast, the ones who enable the central drama but don't receive recognition for it. Gail deserved recognition. She'd given Heather the best possible life under difficult circumstances. She'd written a book to preserve Heather's voice and experiences. She'd connected with a community of collectors who embraced Heather and made her feel special. And in the end, she'd stayed with Heather in the van. She hadn't saved herself and left her granddaughter to die alone. That final act of devotion, staying together even when it meant dying together, was the ultimate expression of who Gail had been all along. The estrangement between Gail and Glenn remained largely unexplored in public accounts. It was private, family business, not relevant to the accident itself, but it mattered in small ways. In the phone call Gail made in her final moments. In Glenn's complicated grief, mourning a woman he'd loved but lived apart from. In the questions that remained unanswered about their relationship and why it had fractured. Marriages end for countless reasons. Sometimes dramatic, sometimes mundane. The specifics of Gail and Glenn's separation weren't anyone's business but theirs. But that separation meant Glenn was grieving alone in some ways. Not technically alone. He had other family, other connections. But without the shared intimacy of partnership. Without someone who'd known Gail the way a spouse knows their partner. He'd lost her twice. Once when they separated. Once when she died. And the second loss meant he'd never have the chance to reconcile the first. By 2007, most of the media attention had faded completely. The case wasn't newsworthy anymore. It had been solved. The mystery resolved. The bodies recovered and buried. What else was there to report? For journalists, it was over. For the public, it was over. The story had reached its conclusion. But for Heather's family, nothing was over. Grief doesn't have a conclusion. It just continues, changing shape over time, but never truly ending. They learn to live around the loss. Not with it. You never really make peace with losing a 15-year-old. But around it. Finding ways to function, to experience joy again, to engage with life, while carrying permanent sadness. That's what survival looks like after tragedy. Not recovery. Not closure. Just the slow, difficult work of continuing to exist in a world that feels fundamentally altered. The Neuse River, constant and indifferent, marked the passage of years. Seasons cycled. Water levels rose and fell. The spot where the van had rested for 10 months saw no change in the river's behavior. No acknowledgement. No memorial. The river had no memory. It simply was. Moving water from one place to another, following the path carved over millennia, responding only to gravity and geography. In that indifference was a kind of truth. The world doesn't stop for our tragedies. Rivers keep flowing. Time keeps passing. Life continues whether we're ready or not. Heather and Gail had become part of the river's history. But the river itself had no history. Just an eternal present, flowing from the mountains to the sea, carrying everything and remembering nothing. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't preserve moments accurately. It edits. It emphasizes certain details while letting others fade. It transforms lived experience into story, and in doing so, changes the truth in subtle ways. For the people who'd known Heather and Gail, their memories began to shift as years passed. The sharp edges of grief softened. The immediate, visceral pain became something more distant. Not gone, never gone, but changed. Some members of Heather's family found themselves unable to remember her voice clearly anymore. They could see her face in photographs. They could recall specific moments, specific interactions. But the sound of her voice, the particular timbre and rhythm that had been uniquely hers, had faded. This is a common experience with grief. The sensory details go first. Voice, scent, the exact texture of someone's hair. What remains are visual memories, frozen images, snapshots rather than living presence. It felt like losing her again. A second death. Not of her body, but of the complete sensory memory of who she'd been. Some family members listened to old voicemail messages, desperately trying to cement the sound of Heather's voice in their minds. But recorded voice isn't the same as living voice. It's flat, incomplete, a shadow of the real thing. Eventually, they had to accept that some things would be lost. That memory couldn't preserve everything. That time erodes even as it provides distance from pain. The book Talks with Angels went out of print several years after Heather's death. The small press that had published it had ceased operations. The remaining copies were sold or given away or ended up in used bookstores and library sales. For a while, the book seemed destined to disappear entirely, to become one of those forgotten texts that exists only in personal collections, known to a shrinking circle of people who remembered why it mattered. But then something unexpected happened. Digital preservation. People who owned copies began scanning them, sharing PDFs on memorial websites and collector forums. The text found new life online, accessible to anyone who wanted to read about Heather's experiences. It wasn't official. It probably violated copyright, though no one seemed interested in enforcing those rights. The book existed in a legal gray area, kept alive by people who believed Heather's story deserved to be remembered. And so it was. In its own quiet, grassroots way. The Precious Moments figurine inspired by Heather's dream remained in production longer than the book stayed in print. The company continued manufacturing it for years. Not in large quantities, it was never a bestseller, but enough that collectors could still find it, could still purchase a tangible piece of Heather's legacy. Some collectors bought multiples, one to keep in pristine condition in the box, one to display, sometimes one to give away to someone else who needed the reminder of hope, of faith, of the belief that suffering leads to peace. The figurine's value, both monetary and emotional, increased over time. Not dramatically, but steadily. It became a sought-after piece among serious collectors. Though that wasn't really the point. The point was what it represented. A girl who'd survived impossible odds, who'd talked to angels, who'd held on to faith through pain. A girl who'd believed she'd see heaven someday, where she could play with her kittens and be free from suffering. Whether that belief was literally true or metaphorically true, or simply a comforting fiction, that mattered less than what it had given Heather. Peace, purpose, a framework for understanding her life. Fort Barnwell changed slowly, the way small rural communities always do. Some families moved away. Some moved in. Young people left for cities. Retirees arrived seeking quiet. The river remained constant. The same bends, the same banks, the same dark water moving steadily toward the sea. Occasionally, someone new to the area would ask about the accident. They'd heard something, maybe. A rumor. A vague story about two people who drowned. The locals who remembered would tell them the basics. Sometimes more, if they'd been directly involved in the search. But mostly just the outline. A grandmother and granddaughter got lost in fog, drove into the river, weren't found for almost a year. Tragic. But these things happen. And then the conversation would move on. Because even tragedies, given enough time, become just facts. Historical events. Stories that get told occasionally, but don't carry the emotional weight they once did. Except for the people who can't forget. For them, the weight never really diminishes. The improvements to rural road safety that had been discussed after the accident were implemented patchily. Some stretches of dangerous road near water received guardrails. Some received better signage. Some received nothing but verbal commitments that went unfulfilled due to budget constraints. This is how systemic change happens, or doesn't happen. Incrementally, inconsistently, dependent on political will and funding and competing priorities. The specific stretch where Gail's van had entered the water did eventually get some improvements. Not immediately, but within a few years. It was something. Not enough to undo what had happened. Not enough to guarantee it would never happen again. But something. And maybe that's all any safety measure ever is. An attempt to reduce risk, not eliminate it. An acknowledgement that we can't prevent every tragedy, but we can try to prevent some. In the decade following Heather's death, attitudes toward missing persons cases evolved somewhat. Law enforcement agencies developed better protocols. Technology improved. Public awareness increased about the importance of acting quickly, of using all available resources, of not giving up even when cases seemed hopeless. Some of these changes were directly influenced by cases like Heather and Gail's. Cases where the missing were eventually found, but not soon enough. Cases where the question, could we have done better, haunted everyone involved. Other changes came from different cases, different tragedies, different lessons learned the hard way. But collectively, they represented progress. Slow, imperfect progress. But progress nonetheless. It wouldn't bring Heather back. It wouldn't give her family closure. But it might help someone else's family. Someday. Maybe. And that had to be enough. The searchers who'd looked for Gail and Heather in December 2004 mostly moved on with their lives. They returned to their regular jobs, their regular routines. The intense days of searching became memories, fading in detail over time. But some of them never quite let it go. The diver who'd been within feet of the van during the initial search occasionally returned to the site. Not frequently, not obsessively, but sometimes, on the anniversary of the recovery or on particularly difficult days, he'd drive out to Fort Barnwell and stand on the riverbank. He didn't know exactly why. To pay respects, maybe. To remind himself that he'd done everything he could. To process guilt that lingered despite logic saying it shouldn't. He wasn't the only one. Other searchers did similar things. Quiet, private acts of remembrance and reckoning. They'd been part of the story. They'd tried to change the ending. They'd failed, through no real fault of their own. And they had to find ways to live with that. Heather's bedroom, which had remained untouched for years, was eventually cleared. Not all at once. Gradually. Over multiple visits, multiple decisions about what to keep and what to release. The Precious Moments figurines were distributed among family members. Each person took the ones that meant something to them, the ones they wanted to preserve as connection to Heather. Some of her clothes were donated. Others were kept, a favorite shirt, a jacket she'd worn frequently, items that carried sensory memory. Her books and writings were boxed and stored. Maybe someone would want to read them someday. Maybe not. But throwing them away felt wrong. Like erasing part of her voice. The room was repainted, refurnished, transformed into a space that could serve the living rather than existing as a shrine to the dead. It was necessary. Healthy, even. But it hurt. Because now there was no physical space that was purely Heather's. No room frozen in time preserving exactly how she'd left it. She existed now only in memory, in photographs, in the objects her family had chosen to keep. In stories told to younger relatives who'd never met her. In the gradual, inevitable process of becoming the past. Glenn Dale died in 2012, 7 years after Gail and Heather. His death received little public attention. A brief obituary. Private funeral. No media coverage. He'd lived those 7 years quietly, privately. Whether he'd found peace with what happened, whether the guilt had ever released him, whether he'd managed to process the trauma of that 3 a.m. phone call, those questions went unanswered. He took his grief with him. And with his death, the last direct connection to Gail, the person who'd known her as a spouse, who'd shared decades of life with her, was gone. Now everyone who remembered Gail remembered her primarily as Heather's grandmother. As the author of Talks with Angels. As a victim of a tragic accident. Her fuller identity, who she'd been before Heather, who she'd been in her marriage, who she'd been in the private moments no one else saw, had largely disappeared with Glenn. That's how it works. We become simpler in memory. Reduced to the roles we played, the stories people tell about us. The complexity of actual personhood fades. The Neuse River continued to claim lives occasionally. Drownings happened. Not frequently, but regularly enough that locals stayed cautious. a fisherman losing his footing, a boater in a storm, children ignoring warnings and swimming in dangerous spots. Each tragedy was its own story, distinct and individual. But collectively, they reinforced what people who lived near the river already knew. Water is beautiful and essential and absolutely merciless. It gives life and takes it with equal indifference. Gail and Heather were part of that larger pattern. Two more names in the long history of people the Neuse had claimed. Not the first, not the last. The river kept flowing. The river kept taking. The river kept its ancient, patient rhythm regardless of human grief. By 2015, it had been a full decade since the recovery. 10 years. Long enough that children born after the accident were now in school. Long enough that the story had faded from active conversation in Kinston. Long enough that you could meet people who lived in the area and knew nothing about what had happened. Time hadn't erased the tragedy, but it had absorbed it, made it part of local history rather than current event. The people who remembered still remembered. The grief hadn't disappeared for Heather's family, but it had been integrated into their lives. They'd learned to function around it, to experience joy despite it, to honor Heather's memory while also living their own lives. That's survival. Not moving on. You don't move on from losing a child or grandchild, but moving forward, continuing, enduring. Because what else can you do? The internet preserved Heather's story in fragments. Blog posts about the case. Forum discussions about mysterious disappearances that turned out to be accidents. Collectors' websites mentioning the Precious Moments figurine and its backstory. Someone created a Find a Grave memorial for Heather online. Strangers left virtual flowers and comments. People who'd never met her expressed sympathy and shared how her story had affected them. It was a different kind of memorial than previous generations had known. Digital. Eternal in theory, though dependent on servers and companies and platforms that could disappear at any time. But for now, Heather existed there. In pixels and databases. Searchable. Findable by anyone curious enough to look. A 15-year-old girl from North Carolina who'd survived a house fire, talked to angels, inspired a figurine, and died too young. Reduced to data points and remembered by strangers. It wasn't how anyone would choose to be remembered, but it was something. Evidence that she'd existed. That her life had mattered beyond the boundaries of family and local community. The question of meaning haunted everything. Did Heather's death mean something? Was there purpose in it? Lesson? Some grand design that made the tragedy bearable? Different people answered differently, based on their beliefs and needs. For some, faith provided answers. Heather was with God now. She'd talked about heaven, about angels, about reunion. Her death was sad, but not meaningless because she'd received what she'd been promised. For others, there was no meaning to find. Just randomness and cruel chance. Suffering that led nowhere, taught nothing, served no purpose. The universe operating according to physics and probability, indifferent to our desire for narrative coherence. Both perspectives were valid. Both helped people cope in different ways. What mattered less was which was true, whatever that means, and more was which allowed people to continue functioning, to find ways to honor Heather while also living their own lives. Gail's legacy beyond her relationship to Heather remained largely unexamined in public narratives. She'd been more than a caregiver. She'd had her own life, her own interests, her own identity before Heather was born, and during the times when caregiving wasn't consuming all her energy. But those aspects of who she was had been overshadowed. First by her role as Heather's grandmother and author of Talks with Angels. Then by her role as victim of the accident. Her fuller personhood, her sense of humor, her frustrations, her dreams, her complexity, existed only in private memory now. Known to family and close friends, but invisible to everyone else. That's a kind of death too. Not of body, but of complete identity. The reduction of a whole person to a few defining characteristics, a few key plot points. Everyone who dies experiences this to some degree. But it's still a loss. A reminder that we can't fully preserve anyone. That memory, history, and narrative all flatten and simplify in ways that erase nuance. The fog, the immediate cause of Gail's disorientation, continued to roll in each winter. December mornings in eastern North Carolina still brought thick radiation fog that made driving treacherous. Still disoriented people on unfamiliar roads. Still created conditions where terrible accidents were possible. The fog didn't care about Heather and Gail. Didn't carry meaning or message. It was just weather. Meteorological conditions resulting from temperature and humidity and atmospheric pressure. But for people who knew the story, fog on winter mornings became something else. A reminder, a trigger for memory, a reason to slow down, to pull over, to wait for better visibility rather than pushing forward into uncertainty. Not everyone had that association. For most people, fog was just an inconvenience, an annoyance that made their commute longer. But for the people who couldn't forget what happened on December 7th, 2004, fog meant something more. Meant danger, meant loss, meant the terrible randomness of the world. There's a particular kind of forgetting that happens with tragedies. Not immediate erasure, not deliberate dismissal, but a slow fading. Like a photograph left in sunlight, the details gradually bleaching out until only the faintest outline remains. By 2020, 15 years after the recovery, Heather's story had become exactly that. An outline. A vague memory that surfaced occasionally in certain conversations, but no longer carried the emotional weight it once had. The new generation growing up in Kinston had never heard of her. The teachers who might have mentioned her story had retired or moved on. The collectors who'd followed her journey had aged, some passing away themselves, their collections dispersed to children who didn't know the significance of that particular figurine with the teardrop eyes. Time was doing what time always does. Not healing exactly, but creating distance, making the past feel farther away. The COVID-19 pandemic, strangely, brought a brief resurgence of interest in older missing persons cases. People stuck at home, scrolling through the internet, discovered true crime content in unprecedented volume. Podcasts, YouTube videos, Reddit threads, deep dives into cases both famous and obscure. Heather and Gail's case appeared in some of these discussions, usually in roundup posts about missing persons found in water, sometimes in threads about search and rescue failures, though those threads were typically more sensational than accurate. A few content creators made videos about the case. Most were respectful. Some were exploitative, focusing on the creepy elements, the angels, the prophetic dreams, the year underwater, rather than the human tragedy. Heather's family, when they encountered these, had mixed reactions. On one hand, it kept Heather's memory alive, introduced her story to people who might never have heard it otherwise, showed that she mattered beyond the immediate circle of people who'd known her. On the other hand, it felt invasive, reductive, like watching strangers pick over the bones of your grief for entertainment. But they couldn't control it. Once a story enters public consciousness, it belongs to everyone and no one. It gets retold, reshaped, reinterpreted. The people at the center lose ownership of their own narrative. The Precious Moments figurine, the girl with angels and kittens, became increasingly rare as years passed. The company had stopped production. The remaining pieces were in private collections. Occasionally one would appear on eBay or at estate sales, often fetching prices far higher than its original retail value. But the price increase wasn't really about scarcity or collectability. It was about the story attached to it. The knowledge that this particular design had been inspired by a real girl who talked about heaven and angels and then died at 15. Collectors who owned it held on to it, passed it down to their children with explanations about where it came from, why it mattered, turned it into a family heirloom not because of monetary value, but because of what it represented. Faith, hope, the belief that suffering has meaning, that death isn't an ending but a transition, that somewhere, somehow, Heather had gotten her wish. Peace, angels, her kittens. Whether you believe that literally or not, the image was powerful, comforting to some, heartbreaking to others, but powerful. The Neuse River, meanwhile, saw changes of its own. Environmental concerns about water quality, development along the banks, debates about conservation versus economic use. The same tensions that play out along waterways everywhere. But the river itself, the physical reality of water flowing from Piedmont to sea, remained essentially unchanged. Indifferent to human concerns, human projects, human grief. It had carried Gail and Heather's bodies for 10 months, then released them when the time came, then continued flowing as if nothing had happened. Because to the river, nothing had happened. Just two more objects entering and leaving the water. No different from fallen trees or discarded tires or any other debris the current carried. The river had no memory, no conscience, no awareness that it had been both grave and secret keeper. It was just water, following gravity, flowing toward the ocean, eternal and meaningless and beautiful and terrible all at once. In 2024, 20 years after the accident, a small memorial gathering was held. Not a big event, not publicized, just family and a few people who'd been directly involved in the search or who'd known Heather and Gail personally. They met at the cemetery where Heather was buried, brought flowers, shared memories, the ones that hadn't faded completely, the ones they'd held on to through 2 decades. Someone read a passage from Talks with Angels. Someone else shared a story about Heather's kindness, a specific moment that had stuck with them all these years. They didn't visit the river. That wasn't part of the plan. The river wasn't where Heather should be remembered. It was just where she'd died. The cemetery felt more appropriate. A place of intentional rest rather than accidental drowning. A place that honored her life rather than commemorating her death. After an hour, maybe 2, people began to leave. Hugs. Promises to stay in touch that may or may not be kept. The acknowledgement that even grief can't hold people together indefinitely. Eventually, the cemetery was quiet again. Just headstones and grass and the wind moving through the trees. And Heather's grave, marked with dates that told you she'd been 15 when she died, but nothing about who she'd been while alive. The question of prevention, could this have been avoided, never found a satisfying answer. Technically, yes. If any of a dozen small variables had been different. If Gail had delayed the trip. If the fog had been lighter. If she'd chosen a different route. If she'd pulled over sooner. If there had been a guardrail. If the initial search had used different equipment or covered a slightly larger area. Any of those changes might have resulted in a different outcome. But you can play that game with any tragedy. Trace the causal chain backward, identify decision points, imagine alternatives. It doesn't change what happened. It just creates an infinite maze of what-ifs that lead nowhere. The more productive question might be, what did we learn? And the answer was practical, not philosophical. Better search protocols. Improved technology. More awareness of the dangers of rural roads near water, especially in poor visibility. These improvements didn't bring Heather back, but they represented the only meaningful response to tragedy. Not revenge or cosmic justice or satisfying narrative closure. Just the quiet work of trying to prevent the next one. Heather's voice, the literal sound of it, was gone now from living memory. Everyone who'd known her remembered her visually. Her face. Her movements. The way she'd looked at her figurine collection with such joy. The way she'd smiled despite pain. But the exact timbre of her voice? The specific cadences of her speech? The way she'd laughed? Gone. Preserved imperfectly in a few old recordings that family members couldn't bring themselves to listen to very often because hearing her voice made the loss too immediate, too raw, even decades later. This is what time does. It erodes the sensory details first, then the precise memories of specific moments. Eventually, what remains is more impression than memory, a sense of who someone was rather than concrete recollection of exact interactions. It's a kind of death after death. The slow disappearance of a person from living memory. From being someone who's missed to being someone who was. From present absence to historical fact. The book Talks with Angels existed now primarily in digital form, shared among small circles online. No major publisher had ever picked it up. No streaming service had optioned it for adaptation. It remained what it had always been. A small, personal testimony of faith and suffering and hope. Known to a few thousand people at most. But those who knew it treasured it. Not because of literary quality. It had been written by a grandmother sharing her granddaughter's experiences, not by a professional author. But because of authenticity. Because Heather's voice came through in the passages Gail had recorded. Because it captured something real about how people make meaning from suffering. In an age of curated social media personas and manufactured narratives, there was something powerful about that unpolished honesty. The book didn't try to tie everything into neat lessons. It didn't smooth over the hard parts or pretend faith made everything okay. It just showed one girl's experience of pain and her attempt to understand it through the framework of angels and heaven and divine purpose. Whether that framework was objectively true mattered less than whether it had helped Heather endure what she had to endure. And it seemed to have done that. Given her comfort. Given her hope. Given her a way to face suffering without being destroyed by it. That was worth preserving. Fort Barnwell continued its quiet existence. The accident was part of local lore now, but distant. Something that had happened 2 decades ago. Most current residents hadn't been there when it occurred. They'd moved to the area later, attracted by affordable property and rural peace. They might hear the story eventually, from a longtime neighbor, from someone at the local store. But it wouldn't mean to them what it meant to people who'd lived through the search, who'd known the family, who'd watched the recovery operation. That's how community memory works. It fragments. Different people carry different pieces. Eventually, as the original witnesses age and die, the story becomes entirely second-hand, then third-hand, then historical record rather than living memory. Heather and Gail's story was well on its way to that transition, moving from that terrible thing that happened to that terrible thing that happened back in 2004. A shift from immediate to historical, from felt to known, not forgotten, necessarily, but changed, distant, less visceral. The searchers who'd looked for Gail and Heather were older now. Some had retired from law enforcement or rescue work. Some had moved away from the area. Some had passed away. The ones who remained occasionally thought about that case, usually on the anniversary, sometimes when they drove past the Neuse River, sometimes for no reason at all, just a random memory surfacing unexpectedly. They'd done other searches since then, found some people, failed to find others, added more experiences to their mental catalog of human tragedy and human resilience. But Heather and Gail's case stayed with them in a particular way. Maybe because of how long the van had remained undiscovered. Maybe because of Heather's age and story. Maybe because of the cruel proximity, being so close and yet missing it for 10 months. They didn't talk about it much anymore. What was there to say that hadn't been said? But they remembered. And remembering was its own form of tribute. The figurine with teardrop eyes sat on shelves in homes across the country. Most of the people who owned it now didn't know Heather's story. They'd inherited the piece from a relative, or bought it at an estate sale because it was pretty, or received it as a gift without understanding its significance. It was just a collectible to them. One piece among many in a precious moments collection. But occasionally, someone would look up the backstory, would discover that the little girl with angels and kittens wasn't just a generic design, but was inspired by a real teenager who'd talked about heaven and then drowned before her 16th birthday. And then the figurine would change for them, would become more than decoration, would carry weight and meaning and sadness. Some people, learning the story, would choose to display the piece more prominently, would tell visitors about it, would turn it into a conversation starter about faith and loss and how we make meaning from suffering. Others would pack it away, would find it too sad to look at regularly, would want their precious moments collection to bring joy rather than grief. Both reactions were understandable. Both were valid ways of engaging with an object that had become, accidentally, a memorial to a girl most people never met, but whose story somehow mattered anyway. The fog still came each winter. Dense, disorienting, dangerous. Drivers still got lost in it, still made mistakes, still occasionally ended up in places they hadn't intended to go, but not as often. The improvements to roads and signage helped. Technology helped. GPS making it harder to become completely disoriented. Cell phones making it easier to call for help. The world had changed in the 20 years since Heather's death. Not enough to prevent all tragedies, but enough to reduce some risks, to make some outcomes less likely. If Gail and Heather's accident happened today, would it end differently? Maybe. Better navigation technology might have prevented them from getting lost in the first place. Better cell phone capabilities might have provided rescuers with more precise location data. Better sonar and dive equipment might have found the van sooner. Or maybe not. Maybe the same variables that aligned in 2004 would align again. Maybe the river would still keep it secret for months. Maybe tragedy would still occur despite all our technological advances. There's no way to know. No way to test the counterfactual. All we can do is remember what happened. Learn what we can. Try to do better. And acknowledge that sometimes, despite everything, terrible things still happen to people who don't deserve them. Heather would have been 40 in 2029 had she lived. She would have been an adult for more than 2 decades. Would have potentially had a career, a family, a full life of experiences and choices and growth. Or maybe not. Her medical conditions were serious. It's possible she wouldn't have lived to 40 even without the accident. Her survival through childhood and adolescence had already beaten long odds. But she should have had the chance to find out. Should have had the opportunity to see who she might become. Should have gotten more than 15 years. The unfairness of that. The sheer, stupid randomness of her death occurring when it did and how it did. never fully resolved. Because it couldn't. Some unfairnesses are just facts. They don't have resolutions. They just are. Heather got 15 years. In those 15 years, she survived a house fire, multiple surgeries, constant medical challenges. She collected figurines and talked about angels and touched the lives of people she never met through her grandmother's book. It wasn't enough time, but it was the time she got. And in the end, the only thing anyone could do was remember her. Remember that she existed. That she mattered. That her life meant something beyond the tragedy of how it ended. The Neuse River, as always, kept flowing. Past Fort Barnwell. Past the spot where a van had entered the water on a foggy December morning 2 decades earlier. Past all the human drama and grief and memory. The river carried rainwater toward the sea. It sustained ecosystems. It flooded and reseeded with seasonal patterns established long before humans built communities along its banks. It had been here before Heather was born. It would be here long after everyone who remembered her was gone. It was ancient and indifferent and eternal in a way that made human life seem desperately brief. But that brevity doesn't make individual lives meaningless. If anything, it makes them more precious, more worth remembering. Heather Lynn Roberts lived for 15 years. She talked about angels. She collected precious moments figurines. She loved her grandmother. She survived impossible odds until, finally, she didn't. Her death was tragic, preventable in countless ways, and yet not prevented. A convergence of fog and unfamiliar roads, and bad timing and bad luck. But her life was more than her death. And memory, however imperfect, however fading, is how we insist on that truth. How we say, she was here. She mattered. She was more than the tragedy that took her. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. Stories like this one don't have satisfying conclusions. They don't wrap up neatly. The questions they raise don't all have answers. But they're still worth telling. Because Heather was worth remembering. Because Gail was worth honoring. Because the searchers who tried their best deserved recognition even when their best wasn't enough. Because tragedy is part of the human experience, and we make meaning from it not by pretending it teaches clear lessons, but by bearing witness to it. By saying, this happened. These people existed. This mattered. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the fragility of life or the importance of caution or the way we remember the dead, share it. Talk about it. Keep Heather's memory alive in whatever small way you can. Like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories told with care and respect. Comment with your thoughts, your own experiences with loss, your reflections on what this story means to you. Because in the end, that's all we can do with tragedy. Share it. Remember it. Use it to inform how we live our own brief, precious lives. The river flows on. The fog returns each winter. And somewhere, in memory, and in whatever might exist beyond memory, a 15-year-old girl who talked about angels and collected figurines and survived impossible odds continues to matter. Not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. And that's worth remembering.